The silence in my loft was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from the smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and loneliness. It was 3 in the morning, a time when the city outside finally held its breath, and the only sounds were the ones inside my own head. The hum of the ancient refrigerator, the whisper of my brush against the canvas, the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. I lived in a converted warehouse, a place of high ceilings and exposed brick that was meant to feel artistic and expansive, but, for me, mostly just amplified the emptiness. My life had become a routine of isolation, a cycle of waking, painting, eating something forgettable from a carton, and then painting again until my eyes burned. The figures on my canvases were my only real companions, twisted, yearning shapes that reached for something just beyond the frame. They were all self-portraits, in a way. It was during these long, silent nights that I first became aware of him. Not as a person, not at first, but as a rhythm, a pattern. At precisely 12:07, 1:07, 2:07, and so on, I would hear the faint groan of the service elevator, followed by the soft, rhythmic tread of boots on the concrete floor of the hallway. Keys would jingle, a sound as soft as wind chimes in a distant room. It was the night security guard, Alex. I only knew his name from a memo tacked to the bulletin board in the lobby, a black and white photo of a man with a serious face and eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. He was a fixture, a ghost in a navy blue uniform who haunted the periphery of my world. I never saw him up close, not in the beginning. I only knew his sounds, the predictable cadence of his rounds that marked the slow, agonizing passage of another sleepless night. He was a human clock, a reminder that while my world was stagnant and contained within these 4 brick walls, the world outside, his world, kept moving, kept turning. I started to anticipate his arrival. The brush would still in my hand around 5 past the hour. I'd hold my breath, listening. The elevator groan, the footsteps, the jingle. Then, silence as he passed my door. A soft click as he checked the fire escape at the end of the hall. Then the footsteps would recede, and the silence that returned felt heavier than before, thick with the knowledge that I was alone again. This went on for months. He was a character in my story that I never interacted with, a steady, silent presence. In my mind, he was a monolith of heterosexuality. He had a square jaw, a build that spoke of practical strength, not gym-sculpted vanity, and a kind of quiet competence that I associated with men who had wives, mortgages, and a favorite brand of domestic beer. He was from a different universe, one where men fixed things with their hands and didn't spend their nights wrestling with phantom shapes on a piece of stretched cloth. He was, in short, completely and utterly safe for me to watch, to think about, because he was impossibly out of reach. An object of abstract appreciation, like a piece of classical sculpture. All form, no threat. Then the break-in started. Not in our building, but in the ones nearby. A coffee shop on the corner had its windows smashed. A gallery 2 blocks down was vandalized. A wave of low-grade anxiety washed over our little industrial neighborhood, and suddenly, security wasn't just a formality. The building management sent out another memo. Security patrols would be increased. The night guard would be making more frequent, less predictable rounds. His name was mentioned again. Alex, please extend him every courtesy. The rhythm broke. The predictability vanished. Now, I never knew when he was coming. The footsteps might appear at 23 past the hour or 41. The uncertainty was a tiny crack in the placid surface of my obsession. It made him feel less like a clock and more like a person. One night, I ran out of cobalt blue and, in a fit of frustration, decided to go down to my storage cage in the basement. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The building was dead quiet. As I stepped out of my loft, locking the heavy door behind me, I heard a soft cough from the end of the hall. I froze. There he was. Alex. He was standing by the large window that overlooked the alley, not patrolling, just looking. The moonlight cut across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and silvering the edge of his uniform. He was taller than I'd imagined. His shoulders were broad, filling out the starchy blue fabric perfectly. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes found me in the dim light. They weren't harsh or suspicious. They were just steady. Evening, he said. His voice was lower than I'd expected, a quiet rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the concrete around us. It didn't echo. It just was. Hi. I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. I held up my key. Just basement. Paint. I felt like an idiot. He gave a slow, single nod. His gaze lingered on me for a second longer than was necessary for a simple tenant interaction. It wasn't invasive. It was observant. He was taking me in, the paint stains on my old t-shirt, the nervous energy radiating off me. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, a ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach his lips. "Be careful," he said, then turned his attention back to the window. Just us. My heart picked up pace. The interaction was nothing. Less than nothing. A two-word exchange in a dim hallway. But for me, it was everything. The abstract sculpture had spoken. It had a voice. It had acknowledged my existence. When I came back up from the basement, clutching a new tube of paint like a holy relic, he was gone. But the hallway felt different. It was charged with the memory of his presence. The air still seemed to hold the faint, clean scent of his soap and the low vibration of his voice. After that night, my observation of him intensified, transforming from a passive habit into an active, all-consuming project. I started leaving my door ajar, just a crack, pretending I needed the cross breeze. From that sliver of a view, I could watch him pass. I learned the details. The way the leather of his duty belt creaked when he shifted his weight. The efficient, no-nonsense way he moved. A quiet economy of motion that suggested a past life in the military or law enforcement. He never swaggered. He simply occupied his space with an unshakable certainty. I watched his hands. They were large and capable, usually resting lightly on his belt or holding a heavy-duty flashlight. I would imagine those hands holding a coffee mug or the steering wheel of a truck or, in my more daring fantasies, gripping the edge of a canvas. I started analyzing his micro-expressions. Most of the time, his face was a neutral mask of professional calm. But I became a connoisseur of the subtle shifts. The slight furrow of his brow when he heard a strange noise from the street below. The almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when the freight elevator made a particularly loud clang. And, on rare occasions, that ghost of a smile, a fleeting upturn at the corner of his mouth, usually when he was looking at something on his phone before starting a round. I wondered what he was looking at. A text from a girlfriend? A wife? A funny video? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, a blank canvas onto which I painted 100 different lives for him, none of which included a lonely artist in Loft 4B. My paintings began to change. The yearning figures were still there, but now they had a new solidity. I was working on a large piece, a figure standing in a dark hallway, bathed in a stark, angular light from a window. The figure was just a silhouette, but I knew who it was. I spent hours trying to get the posture right. The quiet strength in the shoulders, the sense of watchful stillness. I was painting him. I was painting the way he made me feel, seen, and yet completely invisible. One night, a Tuesday, the building's ancient plumbing finally gave up. A pipe burst in the apartment directly above mine, and water began to seep through my ceiling, dripping onto a stack of canvases I had foolishly left leaning against the wall. I panicked. I threw drop cloths over everything, my heart pounding with a frantic energy. I called the emergency maintenance number, only to be met with a sleepy, indifferent voice telling me someone would be there in the morning. The morning was hours away. The dripping was getting worse. In a moment of desperation, I remembered Alex. I threw open my door and ran down the hall toward the stairwell, hoping to catch him on another floor. I found him on the second-floor landing, methodically checking a fire extinguisher. "Alex," I blurted out, my voice echoing in the concrete well. He turned, not with a start, but with that same deliberate, controlled motion. He saw the look on my face, and his professional calm was instantly replaced by a focused concern. "What's wrong?" "Water," I said, pointing vaguely upwards. "My ceiling. It's dripping. A lot." He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. "Show me," he said, already moving past me, taking the stairs two at a time. I scrambled to keep up. When we got to my loft, the dripping had become a steady drizzle in one corner. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The water, my frantic attempts at damage control, the state of my studio. His eyes rested for a moment on the large painting of the silhouette in the hallway. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment, certain he would recognize himself, that he would be creeped out. But his expression was unreadable. He walked over to the dripping patch of ceiling, and pressed his hand against the drywall. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "The main shutoff for this wing is in the service closet on this floor. Stay here. Move what you can." He was gone before I could even say thank you. I heard him down the hall, the jingle of his keys, the metallic clang of a service door opening. A few moments later, the dripping slowed, then stopped. He reappeared at my door, a large bucket in one hand and a roll of industrial paper towels in the other. "This should hold it for now," he said, placing the bucket under the wettest spot. He started unrolling paper towels, efficiently wiping down the surfaces of my paint-splattered work table. I stood there, uselessly, watching him. He was bringing order to my chaos, his quiet competence a stark contrast to my flailing panic. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "You didn't have to do all this." He glanced at me, and for the first time, his gaze felt truly personal. Not the security guard looking at a tenant, but a man looking at another man. "It's my job to make sure the building, and the people in it, are safe." He paused, his hands stilling on the table. "You looked like you needed help." We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the occasional plink of a residual drop of water hitting the bottom of the bucket. He was so close. I could smell the faint, almost unnoticeable scent of his cologne, something clean and woodsy, hidden beneath the starch of his uniform. It was the scent of a man who didn't try too hard. He helped me move the stack of damp canvases to a drier part of the room. As he lifted one, his arm brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting contact of fabric and skin, but it sent a jolt through my entire system. My skin tingled where he'd touched me. I pulled my arm back as if I'd been burned. I was sure he noticed. I was sure he would say something, or give me a strange look. But he didn't. He just carefully placed the canvas against the far wall, his movements still deliberate and sure. He lingered for a moment after we were done, his eyes scanning the studio. "You're the artist," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I tried to be. His gaze fell again on the large painting of the silhouette. He walked closer to it, his head tilted. I held my breath. This is it. He's going to call me out. He's going to think I'm a stalker. "It's lonely," he said, his voice soft. He wasn't looking at me, but at the painting. My breath hitched. He saw it. He saw the feeling I had poured into the canvas, the one I thought I had hidden so carefully behind layers of dark paint. He saw the isolation, the yearning. He saw me. "Yeah," I whispered. "It is." He turned to face me then, and his eyes were different. The professional guard was gone. There was something else there, something deeper. A flicker of understanding, of empathy. He gave another one of his slow nods, a gesture that seemed to hold a world of unsaid things. "Well," he said, his voice returning to a more neutral tone, "maintenance will be here at 8. Let me know if it gets worse before then." He walked to the door, and I followed him, my mind reeling. At the threshold, he paused and turned back to me. His hand was on the doorknob. "You should get some sleep, Leo," he said. He had used my name. I knew he must have seen it on the tenant roster, but hearing it in his low, quiet voice felt shockingly intimate. It was the first time he had ever said it. It landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of my lonely existence. He left, and I stood there in the doorway, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall, the silence he left behind now filled with a terrifying, exhilarating new possibility. I touched my arm where he had brushed against it, the skin still humming with a phantom warmth. He saw me, and he had said my name. The next few weeks were a strange dance of heightened awareness and excruciating restraint. The incident with the leak had broken a seal between us. We were no longer just a guard and a tenant. We were Alex and Leo. When he passed my door now, if it was ajar, he would sometimes pause. "Everything holding up?" he'd ask, gesturing vaguely at the ceiling, which now bore a faint, brownish stain. "Yeah, all good," I'd reply, my heart doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. "Thanks to you," a small nod. That ghost of a smile. Then he'd be gone. These brief exchanges became the focal point of my entire existence. I lived for those 30-second interactions. I'd find myself cleaning the studio at 2 in the morning, just on the off chance he might glance in and see a space that was less chaotic, more inviting. I started paying more attention to my appearance, running a comb through my hair, and changing out of my most paint-splattered shirts before my late-night painting sessions began. It was pathetic, I knew, but I couldn't help it. I was a moth, and he was a steady, quiet flame in the long darkness of my life. I began to notice new things about him. He had a small, faded tattoo on his left wrist, just peeking out from under the cuff of his uniform. It looked like a series of interlocking lines, too intricate to make out from a distance. I wondered about its story. I noticed that when he was concentrating, he had a habit of rubbing his thumb against his index finger, a small, repetitive motion that spoke of a deep-seated patience. I saw him one night through the lobby security monitor, talking to a food delivery guy who was lost. Alex didn't just give directions. He walked the guy to the correct service entrance, his body language open and helpful. He was a good man. The thought settled in my chest with a pleasant, aching weight. One night, a major power grid failure plunged our entire neighborhood into darkness. The building's emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows down the hallways, but my loft was plunged into an almost total blackness. The city outside, usually a constant source of ambient light and sound, was silent and dark. It was unnerving. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon in the dark. Just as I was about to search for candles, there was a firm, solid knock on my door. My heart leaped. I knew who it was. I opened the door to find Alex standing there, his face illuminated from below by the powerful beam of his flashlight. He looked like something out of a film noir, a stoic protector emerging from the shadows. "You okay in here?" he asked. "Yeah, just dark," I said, stating the obvious. "Power's out in about a 10-block radius," he explained. "Could be a while. Do you have any candles?" "A flashlight. I think I have some candles somewhere," I lied. I had no idea. He seemed to read my uncertainty. He stepped just inside the doorway, shining his light around the studio. The beam cut through the darkness, transforming familiar objects into strange, monstrous shapes. My easel looked like a gallows. A stack of canvases became a teetering monolith. "Stay put," he said. "I've got a couple of emergency lanterns in the office. I'll bring you 1 inch." He returned a few minutes later with a battery-powered lantern. He set it on my work table, and it cast a warm, steady glow that pushed back the oppressive darkness. The light was soft, intimate. It made the vast space of my loft feel smaller, more like a sanctuary. "Better?" he asked. "Much. Thank you, Alex. You're my hero tonight." The words slipped out, more earnest than I'd intended. He huffed a small laugh, a quiet, breathy sound. Hardly, he didn't leave. He lingered by the table, his hands resting on his belt. The professional barrier between us seemed to have dissolved completely in the strange, suspended reality of the blackout. We were just two people in a dark room, surrounded by a silent city. "So this is what you do all night," he said, his gaze drifting around the lantern-lit studio. "You make things." "I try," I said again. "It's better than sleeping." "You don't sleep much, do you?" he observed. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "My brain doesn't really have an off switch. I know what that's like," he said, and the admission hung in the air between us. It was the first truly personal thing he had ever offered about himself. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a weariness that his stoic posture usually concealed. It was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of the man behind the uniform. We stood in a comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward. It was companionable. He walked over to a finished painting that was leaning against the wall, one I was particularly proud of. It was a cityscape at dusk, all deep purples and bruised oranges, the lights of the buildings just beginning to flicker on. It was a lonely scene, but I had tried to imbue it with a sense of beauty, a quiet hope. He studied it for a long time. The lantern light caught the hard planes of his face, casting his cheekbones in sharp relief. "It feels quiet," he finally said, "but not empty. Like you're waiting for something." My breath caught in my throat. He did it again. He looked at my work and saw the exact emotion I had poured into it. He saw past the technique, past the colors, and straight into the heart of it. Straight into me. No one had ever understood my art like that. Most people just said, "Oh, nice colors," or "Is that the bridge downtown?" They saw the surface. Alex saw the soul. I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "I think I'm always waiting." He turned from the painting to look at me, and his eyes held a profound, searching intensity. In the warm glow of the lantern, I could see the color of them for the first time. They weren't just brown. They were a complex mix of amber and dark coffee, and they were looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, but it made the air in my lungs feel thick, and heavy. "What are you waiting for, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and soft. The question was a direct hit. It was too honest, too piercing. I couldn't answer it. I couldn't say you. "I'm waiting for someone like you, someone who sees me, and I'm terrified it's actually you." So I just shook my head, offering a weak, self-deprecating smile. "I'm not sure. I guess I'll know it when I see it." He held my gaze for another long moment, and I felt as though he was reading the answer I couldn't speak. He seemed to understand everything. The silence stretched, filled with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It felt like we were on the edge of a cliff, the world falling away below us. A crackle from the radio on his belt broke the spell. A tinny voice requested a status check. Alex blinked, and the intensity in his eyes receded, replaced by his usual professional calm. He was the guard again. I have to check the other floors," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. Of course, he walked to the door, then paused, his back to me. "The lantern should last all night. My shift ends at 7. If the power's not back by then, I'll bring you another battery pack before I go." "Okay," I said. He lingered for a second more, as if there was something else he wanted to say. But then he just nodded to himself and stepped out into the dark hallway, pulling the door gently closed behind him. I was left alone in the warm, golden light of the lantern, my heart hammering a wild, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of him, full of the question he had asked, and the answer I was too afraid to give. The power didn't come back on. I spent the rest of the night not painting, but simply sitting in the lantern light, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. "What are you waiting for, Leo?" The question echoed in the quiet. I was waiting for a sign, for permission, for a signal that the impossible thing I was starting to feel wasn't just a figment of my lonely imagination. True to his word, just before 7 in the morning, there was another knock. I opened it to find Alex standing there, now looking tired from his long shift. The gray morning light of the hallway silhouetted him. He was holding a small, square battery pack. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Just in case, thanks," I said, my hand brushing his as I took it. This time, the contact was more than a simple accident. His fingers lingered against mine for a fractional moment, a deliberate pressure that sent a shockwave up my arm. His skin was warm. I looked up at him, my eyes wide, and I saw him swallow. He had felt it too. I pulled my hand back, clutching the battery pack like a lifeline. The air between us was electric, humming with everything that had been building for weeks. The unspoken words, the loaded glances, the quiet understanding. It was all there, right on the surface, ready to break through. I get off now," he said, his voice slightly strained. He gestured down the hall with his thumb. "Go home. Sleep, you too," I said. He gave me one last, long look, his expression a complicated mix of exhaustion and something else, something I desperately wanted to name. Then he turned and walked away. I watched him go, my entire body thrumming with a nervous energy so potent it made my teeth ache. Something had shifted, irrevocably. We had crossed a line. I just didn't know what was on the other side. For the next few nights, things were tense. The easy, accidental camaraderie we'd found during the blackout was gone, replaced by a palpable awkwardness. The brief conversations at my door stopped. When he passed, he would just nod, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He was avoiding me, and it was killing me. I tormented myself with possibilities. Had I imagined the spark between us? Had I read too much into his kindness, his empathy? Had he sensed my attraction and was now repulsed by it, trying to re-establish a professional distance? The thought was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. My paintings grew darker, more agitated. The canvases were filled with frantic, desperate brushstrokes. I couldn't settle. I couldn't focus. The silence of the loft was no longer a companion. It was an accuser, mocking my foolish hope. I had allowed myself to feel something, and now I was paying the price. The loneliness was sharper, more painful than ever before, because now I knew what its opposite felt like. It felt like standing in a lantern-lit room with a man who saw the truth in my paintings. After 3 nights of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to know, one way or another. I had to break the tension, even if it meant shattering the fragile connection we had. I waited, my stomach churning. I heard the elevator, the footsteps. He was coming. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. As his footsteps drew level with my door, I took a deep breath and pulled it open. I stood there, blocking his path. He stopped, surprised. He looked at me, and for the first time in days, his gaze was direct. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the faint dark circles beneath them. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. "Can we talk?" I asked, my own voice shaking slightly. He hesitated, his jaw tight. He glanced down the empty hallway, then back at me. "I'm on my rounds, it'll just take a minute," I pleaded. He let out a slow, weary breath, a sigh of resignation that felt like a physical blow. But he nodded. "Okay." A minute, he stepped into the loft, but he stayed near the door, keeping a careful distance. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. The guard was back, the walls firmly in place. "What is it?" he asked. I struggled for words. My carefully rehearsed speeches evaporated. All I had was the raw, clumsy truth. "Did I do something wrong?" I finally asked. "The other night, during the blackout. It felt like I don't know. But now you're avoiding me. If I made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. I need to know." He looked away from me, his gaze fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger, that nervous habit I had memorized. "You didn't do anything wrong, Leo. Then what is it?" I pressed, taking a half step closer. "Why are you acting like this?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a conflict so intense it was painful to watch. "It's complicated. Try me," I said, my voice softer now. He was silent for a long time, the quiet in the room stretching into an eternity. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren of an ambulance. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I thought he was going to walk out. I thought he was going to say, "Let's just forget it," and leave me standing there, broken. But then he spoke, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "My job here, there are rules. Fraternization. Professional boundaries." I could get fired, relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees buckle. It wasn't about me. It wasn't disgust. It was his job. "Is that all?" I asked, a sliver of hope in my voice. He shook his head, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "No," he said. "That's not all." And then he looked at me, truly looked at me, and all the walls, all the defenses crumbled. His eyes were raw, vulnerable, and filled with the same desperate yearning I saw in the mirror every morning. It was my own loneliness, my own longing, reflected back at me. "I don't know what this is," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But it's not simple. And it's not just your ceiling leaking or the power going out. It's you. The way you look at things. The way you are. And it's the problem," my breath hitched. A problem. A problem for my very simple, very contained life," he clarified, taking a step toward me. The space between us shrank. "I come here, I do my job, I go home. I don't get involved. I don't feel things. Especially not for a tenant. Especially not for—" He trailed off, but we both knew the word he left unspoken. "A man." The air was thick, charged. We were back on the cliff edge. Only this time, we were closer to the brink. I could feel the pull of gravity, the terrifying, thrilling call of the void. And I knew, in that moment, that I would follow him if he jumped. But this wasn't his move to make. It had to be mine. He had laid his cards on the table, a hand full of conflict and fear and a desire he couldn't name. It was my turn to play. I closed the remaining distance between us. I stood directly in front of him, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I could see the tiny flecks of amber in his eyes. I could smell the clean, woodsy scent of his skin. I lifted a hand, my fingers trembling, and gently touched his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, but warm. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through his entire body. "Is this a problem?" I whispered, my thumb tracing the line of his jaw. He didn't answer with words. He answered by leaning into my touch, a silent, desperate surrender. His arms uncrossed and his hands came up to rest on my waist, his grip hesitant at first, then firm, pulling me closer until our bodies were pressed together. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my chest, a rhythm that was fast and uneven, just like mine. And that was all the permission I needed. I tilted my head up and kissed him. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was months of unspoken observation, of silent yearning, of late-night fantasies and whispered hopes, all crashing together in a single, desperate moment. His lips were firm, surprisingly soft, and they met mine with a hunger that mirrored my own. It was messy and urgent and perfect. His hands tightened on my waist, pulling me impossibly closer, while my fingers tangled in the short, thick hair at the nape of his neck. It was a kiss that blotted out the world. There was no loft, no paint, no job, no rules. There was only this. The press of his mouth, the solid warmth of his body, the quiet groan that rumbled in his chest. It was a confirmation, a confession, an answer to a question I hadn't even dared to ask. This was real. He was real. And he was here, in my arms, kissing me like he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. Just like me. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. His eyes were still closed, his breathing ragged. I kept my hands on his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of him. Problem solved, I murmured, a shaky laugh escaping my lips. He opened his eyes. The conflict was gone, replaced by a look of dazed wonder. A slow, genuine smile finally reached his lips, transforming his entire face. It was like seeing the sun rise after a long, dark night. Or, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. Just getting started, and he kissed me again, slower this time, with a deep, searing tenderness that promised 1,000 more nights, 1,000 more silent conversations, 1,000 more sunrises. The silence in my loft was finally broken, not by noise, but by a presence. By him. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would never be lonely in the same way again. He had to finish his shift. It was the most surreal and agonizing hour of my life. He left my loft with a last, lingering look that was a promise, his composure back in place, but his eyes holding a new, secret warmth just for me. I stood at my door and listened to his footsteps recede, but this time, there was no ache of loneliness. There was only the thrum of anticipation. The world had tilted on its axis. The colors in my studio seemed brighter, the air itself felt lighter. I paced the floor, my mind racing. I touched my lips, which still tingled from the pressure of his. I replayed every second, every word, every touch, committing them to memory. I was terrified. What happened when the sun came up? When he took off the uniform and the rules of the night dissolved into the harsh light of day? Was this just a moment of madness, a shared delusion brought on by exhaustion and proximity? My brain, my old, familiar enemy, started whispering its doubts. He'll regret it. He'll be gone in the morning. This was a mistake. I watched the sky outside my window shift from inky black to a bruised purple, then to a soft, pearly gray. Dawn. 7 o'clock came and went. I imagined him clocking out, handing over his keys to the day guard, walking out the front door of the building and out of my life forever. The knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened with each passing minute. I sank onto my stool, the elation of the past hour draining away, leaving a cold, hollow dread. I had been so stupid. I had risked everything on a single, desperate kiss. Then, I heard a knock. It was a different knock. Lighter, less certain than his official, on-duty knock. My heart stopped. I held my breath. It couldn't be. I walked to the door on shaky legs, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I pulled it open. He was there. Alex. He was out of his uniform, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans. His hair was slightly damp, as if he'd just run his hands through it. In his hands, he held 2 steaming paper cups from the coffee shop on the corner. He looked younger without the uniform, more vulnerable. He looked like a man, not a symbol. He offered me a small, hesitant smile. "Thought you might need this," he said, his voice quiet. I stared at him, unable to speak. He was here. He had come back. He had crossed the threshold from night to day, from guard to man, and he had come back to me. All the doubts, all the fears, evaporated in a rush of overwhelming relief. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," I whispered. He entered the loft, and it felt different having him here in the daylight, in his own clothes. It felt real. He handed me a coffee, his fingers brushing against mine. This time, neither of us pulled away. I led him further into the studio, toward the large windows that were now flooding the space with soft morning light. We didn't talk at first. We just stood there, sipping our coffee, watching the city wake up. The silence wasn't awkward. It was a space for us to breathe, to adjust to this new reality. I didn't sleep, I finally admitted, looking into my cup. Me neither, he said. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. Leo, about last night, my stomach clenched. Here it comes. The regret. I meant it, he said, his gaze unwavering. Everything you felt. I felt it too. I'm not good at this. At talking. At any of it. You're doing okay so far, I said, a real smile spreading across my face. He let out a short, breathy laugh. I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you for months, he confessed, shaking his head. Every time I passed your door, I'd see the light on under it. I wanted to knock. I wanted to just see if you were okay. But I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. That there were rules. I'm glad you broke them, I said softly. Me too. He took a step closer, setting his coffee cup down on a paint-splattered table. He reached out and gently took my cup from my hands, placing it beside his. Then he took my hands in his. His palms were warm and slightly calloused, and they enveloped mine completely. I'm not what you probably think, he said, his eyes searching mine. I've known about myself for a long time. But my life, my old job in the army, it was easier to just keep it packed away, to not deal with it. It became a habit, being alone, keeping everyone at a distance. My heart ached with a sudden, fierce empathy. The stoic protector, the man who seemed so self-contained, had been just as lonely as I was. We were two sides of the same solitary coin. I know the feeling, I said, my thumb stroking the back of his hand. I saw the faded tattoo on his wrist up close now. It was a stylized compass rose. You're a long way from home. He glanced down at the tattoo. Not anymore, he said, his eyes lifting to meet mine again. The meaning in his words was unmistakable. It hit me with the force of a physical blow, a wave of emotion so powerful it made me dizzy. This was the reassurance. This was the quiet, sunlit moment that anchored the frantic, desperate passion of the night. This was real. This was happening. My biggest test, I realized, wasn't him. It wasn't his job or his past. It was my own ingrained fear, the voice in my head that had told me for years that I was destined to be alone, that a love like this was for other people, for the figures in my paintings, but not for me. Looking at Alex, at the quiet certainty in his eyes, at the way he held my hands as if he never wanted to let go, that voice finally fell silent. He leaned in and kissed me again. It was a morning kiss, soft and slow and tasting of coffee and hope. It held all the promise of a new day, of a new beginning. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate step into something unknown but beautiful. We spent the rest of an hour just talking. I learned that he was from a small town in Oregon, that he'd joined the army out of high school, and that he'd moved here 2 years ago for a fresh start. He learned about my art, my family in another state, my ridiculous love for old black and white movies. We were filling in the outlines, turning the ghosts of our assumptions into real, living people. Eventually, he had to leave. He really did have to sleep. But this time, there was no anxiety in his departure. I'll see you tonight, I asked, walking him to the door. The question was loaded. It wasn't just about his shift. He smiled that slow, sunrise smile again. You will, he said. He leaned in, gave me one more short, firm kiss, and then he was gone. I closed the door and leaned against it, a huge, goofy grin on my face. The loft was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the lingering scent of his coffee, the memory of his warmth, the echo of his voice. I walked back to my easel, to the dark, agitated canvas I had been working on for days. I picked up a brush, dipped it in a bright, brilliant cadmium yellow, and with a single, decisive stroke, I painted a streak of light right through the center of the darkness. Our new beginning wasn't a dramatic, sweeping change. It was a series of quiet, gentle moments that slowly, carefully, wove our two solitary lives together. It started that night. When he came on shift, he stopped by my door first. He didn't come in, not while he was in uniform, but he leaned against the doorframe, and we talked for 10 minutes. About his day, about mine. It became our ritual, a small, stolen moment of connection that bookended his shift. On his nights off, he would come over. He'd bring takeout, and we'd eat sitting on the floor of my studio, surrounded by my canvases. He never pretended to be an art critic, but he would look at my paintings with that same intense, quiet focus. He'd ask me questions nobody else ever had. Why did you use that blue there? It feels sad, or this one feels angry. Were you having a bad day? He saw the emotion in the work, the diary of my life written in oil and pigment. And in seeing my art, he saw me. In turn, I began to see him. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the way a slight tension in his shoulders meant he'd had a stressful day, the way his eyes would soften when he was truly relaxed. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He fixed the wobbly leg on my work table without me asking. He started making sure I had milk for my coffee in the morning. He would just listen for hours while I talked about my work, my frustrations, my dreams. He was the calm, steady anchor in the chaotic storm of my creative mind. One evening, he was looking at the large painting of the silhouette in the hallway, the one that had started it all. "You should finish it," he said. "I don't know how," I admitted. "It feels incomplete. Maybe it's not supposed to be one person," he suggested, his voice thoughtful. He came to stand behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We looked at the painting together, our reflection a faint ghost in the dark varnish. Maybe it's two people, one just walking into the light. And just like that, I knew how to finish it. Our intimacy was a slow, beautiful bloom. It wasn't just physical, though that was a part of it, a tender and passionate exploration that felt like coming home. But the real intimacy was in the quiet moments. It was in waking up in the middle of the night and finding his arms slung protectively over my chest, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. It was in the comfortable silences, where we could sit in the same room for an hour, him reading a book, me sketching, and not need to say a word. It was in the way he'd look at me from across the room, a small, private smile on his face, a look that said, "There you are. I see you." The loft, once a monument to my isolation, transformed into our sanctuary. It was still filled with the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, but now it was mingled with the scent of his coffee, the clean fragrance of his soap, the unique, warm smell that was just Alex. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was a peaceful, shared quiet, full of unspoken understanding and the simple, profound comfort of his presence. I was standing by the window one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in strokes of pink and gold. Alex came up behind me, wrapping me in a hug from behind, his body a warm, solid weight against mine. We stood there for a long time, just watching the day begin. I thought back to all those nights I had spent alone in this room, watching, waiting. I had been a passive observer of my own life, a lonely artist painting his own loneliness onto canvases. I had been waiting for something to happen, for someone to come along and save me from myself. But Alex hadn't saved me. He had simply walked into my life and shown me that I was capable of saving myself. He had seen the person I was, hidden behind walls of fear and self-doubt, and he had quietly, patiently, waited for me to let him in. He was the catalyst, the steady hand that had given me the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of my neck. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. I leaned back into him, a feeling of deep, bone-weary peace settling over me. I looked around the studio, at the half-finished canvases, the messy tables, the two coffee cups sitting side by side. My life was still messy, still a work in progress. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was ours. "Nothing," I said, turning my head to kiss him. And everything. The sun cleared the tops of the buildings, flooding the loft with a warm, brilliant light. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything at all. I was already home.